Tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about meditating and having a kind of helpful and healthy approach to the body and the mind and the forms around us, to the world we live in, pretty much. And the Buddha's instructions to his son, Rahula, on how to relate to the world around him. And how it's very, very helpful in terms of having some balance. And because the world is as understood in the Buddha Dharma as having a lot of finding a healthy way to relate to the world around us is not a given. We have to work on a certain perception and perspective that'll help us relate without experiencing some negative states of mind. You know, when the Buddha spoke in what's called the fire sermon, called the Adita Pariyaya Sutra, he expressed that relationship really clearly and how fraught, how really liable it is to be mishandled, and how often we mishandle our relationship with the world so that we end up, experiencing suffering. And what the Buddha taught to his son Rahula, just on the way when they were walking for alms, and I'm going to share that sutra also with us. It's called the Theravada Sutra, the great teaching to Rahula that the Buddha gave him. Basically, giving him great advice on how to relate to the world in a healthy way. And so I'd like to share that with us. But first, I want to read a bit of the fire sermon so that we can understand just how problematic that relationship can be. And the Buddha Dharma, in a sense, when we talk about the teachings in meditation, it is really about trying to return to a real inner balance and healthy relationship to the world. In the same way that the Buddha's life, initially, when he started to become an ascetic, he was in a state of denial. And then he, found balance after being very indulgent as a prince, being very self-denying as an ascetic, and then finding the middle way between extremes. So that's something that he tries to teach to his son, and I want to look at it. Because if we don't do that, then here's what happens. If we don't do that. Okay, he says, all bhikkhus, monks, sangha, all things are on fire. And what are these things which are on fire? What is on fire? These fires of, what are these fires? And generally we understand the fires are the fires of attachment, of anger, and of delusion. The fires are the poisons. But here's what the Buddha says. What is this fire? The eye is on fire. Forms are on fire. Eye consciousness is on fire. Impressions received by the eye is on fire. Whatever sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, or indifferent, is also on fire. And which is an odd statement. So he explains it. And this is really helpful because the Buddha is good at explaining things. And he doesn't leave it just for us to figure out, what does it mean that the eye is on fire? And all these sense impressions are on fire. So it's really clear. With the fire, With what are these on fire? With the fire of passion, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of infatuation or lust, with the fire of birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, misery, grief, and despair, they are on fire. So there we get really, the problem is not that we see things and hear things and are, go to a restaurant and read a menu or see people who are beautiful or, see ads on the computer, or we go through the world or those are the things that attract us, or the things that cause us, aversion, like all the difficult things that we experience throughout the day, whether it's physical or mental or emotional. And it says pretty clearly, like the problem is not really the fact that those things happen. The problem is what he said here was the passion, the hatred, the lust, okay, the despair, all the ways we relate. So our relationship is unbalanced. We have an unbalanced relationship with the world around us. And that lack of balance causes us to, suffer. That's sort of, there's this, something needs to light up the object. If you have a piece of wood, the wood is going to burn, but something needs to light it. And what, brings that fire into it is he says, the hatred, the aversion, the greed, the attachment, the delusion, those things, that way of relating to external things. Okay, and then he goes on and says, the ear is on fire, sounds are on fire. Okay, he goes through all the senses. He starts with the eye and then goes to ear and goes to taste and then tongue. And then what do we do about that? Yeah. He says, understanding this, the learned and noble disciple conceives non-attachment for the eye, non-attachment for forms, non-attachment for the mind, non-attachment for ideas. And understanding this non-attachment, he removes himself from craving. And by this, he becomes free. And when he is free, he becomes aware that he is free. And he knows that rebirth is exhausted. And he can live the good life and has done what he can do. And there's no more for him in this world. So, and it always ends like a kind of Zen koan where it says, now while this exposition was being delivered, the minds of the 1,000 monks became free from attachment and delivered from suffering. That's a very like koan ending for it. He heard the words and became enlightened. So it started in the Pali Sutras here, that whole approach. But it's true, we have these turning words, and if we take those words really seriously, we understand, how do I deal with this unbalanced relationship of, responding to the forms that I meet and the perceptions, and also the mind. And this is really, when he says non-attachment to the mind and non-attachment to ideas. The important thing to notice here is he didn't say not to have thoughts and not to have ideas, but to have a healthy relationship to thoughts and ideas of non-attachment. But again, non-attachment is a really difficult term, because what does it mean? Does it mean that I just don't care, or I see it and I'm indifferent to it, or I just kind of have a sense of removal and withdrawal? Non-attachment is so easily misunderstood as kind of having indifference. And sort of just letting things be because I'm shutting down my caring about it. Say, yeah, the world's going to go to hell, or everyone's going to die of the virus, and I'll find some inner balance on my island. That's just not what non-attachment is here. Okay? But in order to explore non-attachment, to understand it more deeply, this is where I want to move from the Fire Sutra, which again didn't have so much in it for us to, explore. He tells us we got a problem in the way we are relating to things, and in the way we're relating to our mental objects, our mind, in the way we relate to forms, in the way we relate to perceptions and sensations, all of the different aggregates, the skandhas, we have form and we have perceptions, feelings, form and sensations, and then perceptions, how we kind of cognate and understand things. And then we have, thoughts that I like or dislike them. And then I have a sense of me, consciousness. So all of those 5 skandhas, those, ways a person is made up, can be related to in an unhealthy way. And this is what the Fire Sutra is telling us, that when we relate to forms in the world, or we also relate to our own thoughts and ideas about them in a way that is attached and grasping, or aversive and hateful, then it's igniting it. It's igniting it. It's lighting a fire in our mind that is going to hurt. Right? That fire did not need to happen. Okay? So in a sense, when we have the truth, the third truth of Nirodha, it's called, which is extinguishing, it's putting out the fire. It didn't mean that we're putting out, being in the world and doing things. It just meant that we're no longer going to relate those things with our habits of attachment and aversion, of craving and hatred. But how do we do that? It's a lot easier said than done, exploring non-attachment. And this is where I want to get to the advice that he gave his son, Rahula. Because it's going to give us some more insight and understanding into what non-attachment means and how we can, recover a sort of a more balance in the way we relate to forms. So I'm going to share this now with you. So, the Blessed One was staying at Savatthi. I'm reading the sutra directly in Jeta's Grove. And it was early in the morning. He put on his robes and carrying his bowl and outer robe, he went into Savatthi for alms, collecting food. And Rahula, early in the morning, also did the same. And he was following right behind the Blessed One. So it was like the father and son walking together to get alms. It's quite a nice scene if you can think of it. The commentaries say that Rahula was 18 at this point. So he's kind of a grown man, ready to get drafted into the army. But instead he follows his father and becomes a monk. And the Blessed One, he says, then the Blessed One looked back at Rahula and said to him, Rahula, just saying, he kind of like looks back, he sees his son there, says, Rahula, it's like, I have something to tell you. Rahula, any form whatsoever that is past, future, or present, internal or external, there are internal forms. Those are our ideas and our consciousness and our mind. So any form whatsoever, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, the sublime forms, far or near, every form is to be seen as it is, actually. You should see it as it is, actually, with right understanding. As, this is not mine. This is not myself. This is not what I am. Just form, O Blessed One? Just form? Form, Rahula, feeling, perception, understanding, and consciousness. Will and consciousness. Right? So we look at everything that's happening, and this is the key to understanding what non-attachment means. It doesn't mean it's not happening. And it doesn't mean even I can't have a relationship to it. But it means I look at it for what it is. I look at it for what it is. It's an ephemeral, changing, and impermanent phenomena. That's not me. Not me. The underlying key here is getting a good understanding, a good insight into the nature, not of the world, the nature of the self. If we want to find freedom, it's not going to be in the world. It's going to be in how we understand ourselves. This is where we will be liberated from the negative ways we relate to the outside world, is by having a really good understanding of who and what we are. And the Buddha says clearly to Rahula, his son, he says, look at everything around you and look at everything within you and say, not me. No, not me. That's the ultimate non-attachment. None of it constructs a self. No, none of it constructs a self. Like when the Buddha became enlightened and he said, oh, builder of this house, I see through you. Like there's no builder there. Right? So this is really quite a powerful teaching, because that gets to the heart of what the Buddha Dharma is doing, is trying to shine a light to see through the delusion we have of this really, really, stable, unchanging, and permanent self. We don't think of it that way. We don't say, I'm permanent and unchanging. We just relate to ourselves as if we are. So it's not so much what you think about, it's the way you relate to the outside world as needy. Needy for what? To reinforce my sense of self. The problem with trying to reinforce your sense of self and to improve it or to strengthen it and make it more secure is because it's not really there, it'll never be made secure. So you're always going to have to be investing more and more in it. That's the crazy delusion and the vicious circle, is that the more we invest, the less we find it's actually sticking. And so the more we have to invest in it. So Rahula then asks the amazing question that any 18-year-old son of the Buddha would. He then says, he sat on a tree and he said, who then is going to go, who would go into town? Who's going into town to ask for alms? Who's going into town to beg then? Yeah. It's like, if there is no self, then who's walking on the road right now? What's really helpful about these sutras is it doesn't take the teachings for granted that, yeah, you'll get it, or just take it because the Buddha said so. Because, that's the most, you would say, the most expected, common sense, and right question to ask after someone tells you, nothing is you. Nothing is you. And then you ask, well, then who just heard that? Who just heard you say nothing is you? It's a dilemma. It's a paradox. If I don't have a self, then who's speaking right now? Who's speaking? Who's saying this? Who desires anyway? And if I don't have a self, then why is the desire so strong? Or the aversion so strong? Who's feeling aversion? This is a dilemma that, Rahula directly asked. And the other interesting thing about a sutra like this is that the Buddha does not answer him directly. The Buddha doesn't answer. What happens then is Venerable Sariputta. Sariputta, hi Jonathan. Sariputta then walks over to Rahula. And instead of answering that question, what does he say to him? He says, Rahula, you should develop the meditation of in and out breathing. You should work on mindfulness of breath. That's what he says to him. Now, Sariputta is known for his great wisdom. Okay, more so than Ananda, the sidekick, the Sancho of the Sanchez of of the Buddha. So Sariputra says to Rahula, he says, he's not saying like I'm not gonna tell you that there's no answer to this question. I'm going to, kind of give you a little advice of how you might approach that question. You approach it by sitting down and watching your breath. That's how you're going to answer that question, which is extremely helpful and wise. Because the last thing you want to get into, especially with Sariputra or with yourself, is an intellectual debate about who and what is the self. It's going to lead nowhere. And it's definitely not going to relieve your suffering if you, have a internal debate about selfhood. The Buddha said, look at everything, and say, this is not me. This is not self. How can it be? Because it's a form that is inherently unstable and made up of lots of other conditions. So how can I say that's me? Well, that's what the Buddha said to Rahula. Rahula then asked, well then, who's listening to this? Who's saying it? And who's walking and begging for food? I just don't get it. Which is the right question to ask. Because the mind that is perplexed is the mind that's going to, look and observe. So, Shariputra gives him some practical advice, says, sit down and observe your breath. Practice anapanasati, which is the mindfulness of breath, and do that for a while. The Buddha then later on comes by and sees him sitting there practicing mindfulness. And Rahula asks him again the question, how is this going to help actually? How is it going to help? And what's really nice about this sutra is that it doesn't take anything for granted, and it doesn't think these questions are beginners or foolish questions. You're asking who the self is. You're told to meditate. You meditate, and then you wonder, well, how is this going to help anything? And that's exactly what Rahula asked. He said, how, Lord, is mindfulness of in and out breathing to be developed and pursued so that it'll be of great benefit? Like, how is this going to help? Rahula is asking, and how can I do it? So how should I practice this so it'll be helpful? And here is the place where I wanted to get to, where the Buddha gives a special instruction to Rahula of how to practice mindfulness of breath so it'll be of great benefit. A benefit for what? A benefit to help you let go of attachment to self. Because it's that attachment to self and strong identification with an idea of yourself that creates a lot of difficulty when things either don't agree with that idea or they agree with that idea and we want them. The aversion or attachment, which is all about either supporting or threatening our sense of self. So the Buddha then gives this wonderful instruction again to Rahula, where he says, Rahula, any form, anything that is past, future, or present, as he said before, internal or out, external, you say, this is not mine, this is not what I am. And these are the 5 properties, Rahula. Which 5? The earth property, the earth element, the water element, the fire element, the wind element, and the space element. So he then goes over those 5 elements, and he teaches Rahula on each element what to look at very closely. He says, what is the earth element? The earth element can be internal or external. What is the internal earth element? Anything internal within oneself that's hard and solid. Head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, tendons, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, membranes, intestines. It goes through everything in the body. Anything within oneself that's hard, solid, and sustained. This is called the internal earth element. Now, both internal earth property and external earth elements are simply earth elements. And it should be seen as what it is, with present and right discernment. This is the key. It should be seen as what it is, with right discernment. The Buddha says, this is not mine. This is not me. This is not myself. When one sees this and actually is present with right understanding, one becomes unattached with the earth element. Wow, that's actually quite direct and at the same time very subtle. Because the earth element within oneself and without oneself is understood as anything that's hard and solid and, touchable. Anything touchable. Internal, it's all the parts of your body. Anything that is hard. And external, it's all the forms around us. What you're sitting on is earth element. Your cushion is earth element. The wall is earth element. Anything solid. Okay, these bells are earth element. Anything I touch is earth element. The food I eat is earth element. Anything I desire that looks like a form is earth element. My teeth are earth element. My hair. And then he gives the, really amazing statement and teaching of saying, look at all that. External, internal. With the same discernment, wise understanding, which is, this is not me. It's not mine. That's really quite an amazing approach, especially when it comes to one's own body. It's a huge corrective to a kind of really unbalanced relationship we often have either to outside forms or one's own body. And how much, when we experience, say, illness or sickness or aging or death, how much fear and anxiety that brings up. Panic. Or just the slow kind of, the more subtle dread and fear of something bad happening to yourself, to your body. We identify very strong with our body. And the Buddha starts with that because it is such a strong sense of attachment. This is me. There's the metaphor of the wagon that the Buddha, famously taught about, asking, when is the wagon not the wagon? Is it when you take the wheels away or whatever? When does it stop becoming this form called a wagon? When is it a wagon? And the wagon is this idea. It's an idea. And to a horse, is a wagon? Or is it just like a heavy weight on its back? And to the dog, is the wagon a wagon? Or is it just like something you chase after? And as human, the wagon is like our vehicle we use to carry things. So to our body. Meditation on the earth element, in order to cultivate non-attachment and in order to cultivate right discernment, when you look at the different parts of oneself, you say, this is a changing phenomena. This is an impermanent phenomena. This is not me, not self. You know? Even as a type of mantra, it helps us loosen our grasp. It doesn't mean all of a sudden you're going to be selfless because I say it. It's not some sort of magical spell. But it slowly starts to untangle a really over-identification. It doesn't mean you're not going to have a lot of sense of self with your body and mind. But we over-identify. And so what the Buddha is offering is a sort of a corrective, a corrective view. So we can find some middle way here between saying there is no self, because Rahula asked a really common sense question. Well, then who's walking with you? Who's going to the village? Sit down, sit and breathe, and observe phenomena as it passes through, as it changes. Feel the forms. As you breathe, feel your stomach press against your shirt or your pants. That's the earth element. Feel the skin. Anything firm and solid that you feel, there is earth element. And the helpful perspective here is that before we say my teeth, my behind, my legs, my feet, we first see it as solid earth element. And so the difference between inner earth element and outer earth element breaks down. Because he says, it's either internal or external. Like that's just our own way of looking at it, because how we're fixed on this. But you start to see that there isn't such a strict division between internal and external when it comes to earth element, right? There's like this solid body, but then there's this solid chair. Okay, well, there's a lot of solids around. We start to break down this strong grasp we have on me, my lungs, my ribs, my shoulder, my ears. This is the usefulness of the earth element. And the meditation the Buddha gives is to really, really explore it in a very keen observation. Now, of course, they used to go to like charnel grounds and, funeral pyres and look at dead people and look inside and stuff. I mean, we actually don't have to do that, but you can go online and look at the inside of a body, a dissected body, medical school images, and it's really quite a phenomenon. You can see live heart surgery going on. That's in me. It almost seems like, how could that be in me? I'm used to this beautiful form, or whatever form you have, ugly form, whatever I'm judging myself as. But then you open it up and look inside and you see skeleton. That's me. So it's an insightful visualization. And we should be creative with it. If you're feeling attached to your muscles and stuff, there was this one, few years ago, there was this really amazing art exhibit where they took cadavers, bodies, and they preserved them in a way that they had taken the skin off and preserved the body and put them in like artistic poses. And they traveled around the world and displayed these bodies that had been, had the skin taken off. And when one of them, the arm was like holding the skin like a sheet. The one was in a ballet pose, and someone sitting and playing chess. I mean, it was really unbelievable to see this, because you saw, like, you take off the skin and that's me. Yeah. This is the earth element. Of course, then we go into the water element. What is the water element? And the Buddha says, it's either anything internal or external. What is the internal? The internal is anything water or watery. It's bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, oil, saliva, mucus, urine, anything else internal that's watery. Okay, and he says, now both the internal and external are simply water, and they should be seen as they are with right discernment and right understanding. You become unattached, and you simply say, this is not mine, this is not me, this is not myself. Okay, so the water element is also, when you're sitting and meditating and there's saliva. You have a runny nose, there's mucus. You can actually, if you're really, really paying attention, you can feel your blood pumping and your heartbeat. If you cut yourself, you will see blood. You look in the mirror, look closely, and look at the veins on your eye, on your sclera, the whites of your eyes, and you'll see red from blood. Okay, there's a lot of water. You're 75, 74% water. That's serious water element. It's more than the earth element. The earth element seems so hard and strong, but actually there's more water element in you. So being aware of that is quite interesting. And then being aware of it externally as well. When you drink a glass of water, when you drink something, some fluid, and there's attachment or there's aversion. You're walking around, there's urine, there's aversion there. Okay, there's orange juice, there's attachment. Our relationships to the water element are very different. So noticing water element as something that we also experience strongly, and using that as a mindful observation in your own self. Dogen, I'm going to skip to Dogen for a second, because in his Mountains and Waters Sutra, he talks a lot about water, and he brings it in a very Zen and very different way. But it has a really wonderful and expansive perspective of the water element. And I'll share this with you from the Mountains and Water Sutra. He says, when water rises to the sky, it becomes raindrops. Raindrops vary according to the different worlds. Water exists inside fire and inside mind, thoughts, and ideas. Water also exists within the wisdom of realizing Buddha nature. When it falls to the ground, it becomes rivers. And this means when water reaches the ground, it turns into rivers. He does this. The essence of rivers becomes wise people. Also, do not think that where water forms rivers or oceans, there is no world and no Buddha land. Even in a drop of water, innumerable Buddhas appear. The existence of water is not concerned with past, future, present, or the phenomenal world. Yet water is the actualization of the fundamental point. That's the Genjo koan, is the actualization of the fundamental point. So from Dogen's understanding, water, a drop of water, is innumerable Buddha, and the full realization of the truth of existence, the fundamental point. Now, that is pretty remarkable and pretty outrageous. But what it does is it makes a very simple observation, like looking at water in your mouth, in your glass, as you drink it, as you cry, as you brush your teeth, right? As you feel your heart pumping, liquid blood, knowing that all of that is part of this Buddha reality that we live in. So what Dogen is trying to do is trying to bring our awareness of the real magic and specialness of each element within us. He looks at water, he looks at mountains too, and he does the same thing for mountains, which is the mountains and water sutra. So looking at earth and looking at water as this is the place where we find enlightenment. It's in this elemental world that we find it. And that is Dogen's, perspective on water, on the element of water, right? It's each drop contains innumerable Buddhas and full realization. So to continue a little bit with just the other elements, so we can feel like we kind of have a sense of this. He goes, of course, to the fire. The Buddha then teaches Rahula about the fire element after this. Okay, and he goes again, he says, the fire element internal is anything internal belonging to oneself, where there is fire, fiery, sustained, where there is warmth, there is age, there is fever, anything that is eaten and drunk, chewed and savored, and gets digested. It goes into the body and becomes energy with oneself. That is fire, fiery, and sustained. That is called the internal fire property. And now both internal and external fire, okay, is simply fire. And it should be seen as it is with right understanding that this is not me or mine, okay? This is not myself. And then you become unattached from it. So the fire element internally is any sense of warmth and metabolism. The difference between, basically the difference between someone who's alive one moment and dead the next moment is that a live person is still warm. So the fire element is that sense of being alive in this moment. You have warmth. The metabolism is this force of energy within you. You eat food and it is metabolized into energy that keeps you warm. It's like a kind of low-level fire. You got an oven in there where you're putting in coal. The coal happens to be, food, and it transforms into heat. Right? So as he said, you eat food and it's metabolized into your warmth and your energy that is fire, which is really an amazing element of life that's within each person. So to be aware when you're sitting in meditation and you suddenly are aware of heat, you're aware of coldness. To be aware of warmth or cold is to be aware of fire element. And it's something useful sometimes is that when you're walking around or you're sitting and you notice changes of temperature on your skin, the perception of touch, and it's in terms of temperature, then what you can also have that perspective is you're noticing the fire element, the fire element. And anytime you're eating food and it's digestion and production of waste matter is fire element. You are metabolizing and it's turning world into energy. It's using fuel and creating fire within yourself. Fire is any form of heat. As the Buddha is saying internally, it's anytime you feel warmth. You feel cold and you put on a jacket and you suddenly feel warm. How did that warmth come? It didn't come from the jacket. It came from the fire element that is being held in by the jacket. So the fire element is any type of temperature you notice as you sit and as you go through your day in changing of temperatures. And again, what he says, the wise discernment is, it's not me, it's not mine. So we have earth element, solidity. We have water element, fluidity. Right? We have fire element is temperature, heat, and coolness, which is just a fluctuation of that heat. And then we have the air element, which is breath. Okay? Breath is the air element that you're breathing in and breathing out. And that's the air element. And we notice it internally as it goes into your lungs, and externally as you have a transference from the inside to the outside and from the outside to the inside. So the connection of internal and external when it comes to the air element is really clear. It's more clear than any other element. We see that connection between internal and external because we're breathing it in directly. So That's the air element, and we can notice that very clearly by breathing. You feel the solidity. So we breathe and we are noticing air element. We're sitting and we're noticing the solidity of the body, and you've got this earth element. You feel the temperature, heat and the warmth or the coolness, and that's fire element. You swallow and you feel fluidity or a dry mouth. You've got water element. And water element is also that everything is held together, because if you didn't have water element, you'd have a pile of ash, and dust. So the water element is also the fact that things congeal and are held together. That's the water element as well. Just add water, and then you've got something going. Those 4 elements. And then the last element that the Buddha talked about was the element of space. And space is not something that we actually touch and feel. It's something we don't touch and feel, but we know that we have this awareness that we are in space, that we are taking space, and every form is taking space. And by breathing, I'm breathing in space, and that everything exists in a type of space. And it's internal space of your awareness and external space of everything, in form. So when we look at these 5 elements as meditation instructions, the instruction is very clear that you're doing these not to just become more aware of those elements, but to become aware of a relationship to those elements, which is not based on identification, which is not based on, defining yourself by those elements. But when you can train the mind, and this is why, Shariputra said to Rahula, you have a question about yourself, sit down and watch your breath. And then Rahula asked his father, well, so how do I watch the breath? And then his father said, you watch the breath by looking at the breath in and out, but then you also include these 5 elements. And as you're breathing, watching the breath, you're also aware of solidity, you're aware of, water, and you're aware of fire and air, and then the space you're in, and all this. And by seeing all those arise, each time you start to feel like, oh, I'm cold, or I'm hot, or I'm solid, or I'm thirsty, you stop with just before you say the I. You can say, this is not me. This is not me. And remembering the non-self there means that then you can observe all these things without getting trapped by them, without getting attached. And that's how he says it can be of benefit. So it brings us back to the fire sermon, where we're asking, okay, well, the way we can look at all these forms with non-attachment. Well, what does non-attachment mean? It means you look at them and you unidentify with them. You unidentify. You can say again and again, there is these forms of elements that I'm mindful of, and it doesn't have a name. It's not me. It's not mine. This is a training we do. Okay? It's not something you say and you say, yeah, I'm free of this. Because our investment in this is really strong. But the point is not to have an unbalanced relationship that quickly snowballs into strong attachments, passions, and aversion or hatred. So these are techniques that are very helpful, but they take a certain amount of guided practice. When we're meditating in general mindfulness of breath, we're not necessarily going through the different elements. I brought up the sutra of the teaching to Rahula because he brings up a very clear and direct process of looking at these different elements in order to help us when we're feeling kind of stuck, right? And we're feeling kind of attached. And it's one of the sort of techniques that the Buddha teaches. He taught this specifically to Rahula. Now, I don't necessarily advise doing this on a daily basis, but I do think that as a meditation training, it's one of the techniques we can use in order to loosen the tight hold, the hold we have on our sense of self, and how our sense of self is very much connected to, my body and how my body is made up and my environment and how I see the environment. But if I start to switch my perspective and for some contemplative time, observe it in terms of the elements, it's helpful to loosen our grasp. So what I would like to finish though with, and then I'll ask you if you have a question, is the final teaching that the Buddha gave Rahula in this sutra. And you'll understand why I really want to share this, because it brings the heart back into it. And one of the things that's really important in our meditation practice is that it stays, as Suzuki Roshi said, that you have a warm zazen, that your zazen is warm. Because looking at form and looking at earth and water and fire and air can make it seem sort of, if not technical, kind of removed. That the not me can be sort of a distancing. And that's a misunderstanding. And it's a misunderstanding that Buddha recognized could easily happen. And this is why he gave the next instruction. So I want to share this with you. Okay, after he went through space and air and space, he finishes by saying this to Rahula. Develop the meditation of goodwill. For when you are developing meditation of goodwill, ill will be abandoned. Develop the meditation of compassion. For when you are developing the meditation of compassion, cruelty will be abandoned. Develop the meditation of appreciation. For when you are developing the meditation of appreciation, resentment will be abandoned. Develop the meditation of equanimity. For when you are developing the meditation of equanimity, irritation will be abandoned. Develop the meditation of perceiving impermanence. For when you are developing the meditation of perceiving impermanence, the conceit that I am will be abandoned. Develop the meditation, and this is his final point where he goes full circle. Develop the meditation of in and out breathing. Mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, is of great benefit, of great fruit. And then he goes over the instruction of the mindfulness of in and out breathing, again, just to make sure that we really got it. So, to summarize, when the Buddha taught that the world is on fire, he meant that we are, through our attitudes and our desires and our aversions, we keep trying to light things up. We're like a child playing with matches. The way to stop playing with matches and lighting things up is to develop non-attachment to the things that we're looking at that we want to like hit with a match. It doesn't mean we don't want to have that orange juice or that relationship. It just means I'm not going to strike it with a match. And that match is the sense of self that we're always hung up on and interpreting everything through. So in order to not interpret the world just as through my sense of self, the way we develop that, one of the techniques, which is a powerful one, is observing yourself and your experience through the understanding of these 5 different elements: the earth, the water, the fire, and the air element, and the space element. And by seeing these as not me, within yourself and without of yourself, outside of yourself. And then in order to make sure that it is beneficial and useful, we remind ourselves of compassion and kindness, of goodwill and compassion and non-attachment. And then to finish up, we return to the breath. So here we have in this sutra, these 2 sutras, a pretty complete meditation practice in order to be less attached, to realize non-self, to observe closely your experience, and to make it value-based, that you really want to help. So what I'd like to finish with us all is to return to our mindfulness of breath, because that's what the Buddha taught to end his teaching, and I think we should end our teaching that way. But before we return to mindfulness of breath, is there any question that someone would like to ask?
Oh, I have a
Sila.
question. Oh, sorry.
Sila. I don't hear you. You have to take off the mute, Sila.
Technical problems is for fire. Okay. I wanted to ask, when you emphasize the things that we are not we, I could understand. I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. And when you offered to come back in the meditation, you offered us virtues, yeah? Like compassion and goodwill. It's as if some kind of exchange. I can give you, Buddha, my solid things, my elements, and I get back some virtues back. And I want to ask if this is a good way to grasp myself, if it's legitimate to say myself. I mean, as a virtue.
Yeah. If you're going to identify with something, it should be, when he says goodwill, it should be like loving kindness and compassion, equanimity. Okay, those were what he was saying right here, is these qualities are the sort of enlightened self. Because it's not about what you get out of it, it's what you give. See, all those qualities are, qualities that encourage help. So it's not really self-centered. They're qualities that are other-centered. So most of the other ways of relating to ourselves and world and the elements is more about like what I'm going to get out of it. These qualities are all about what I have to give. What can I offer? What can I offer? So in terms of like that exchange, yeah, that's a way of making sure that when you are looking at the elements, you're not doing it as a sort of abstract or intellectual or kind of even a self-centered sort of way. It's for the sake of being less self-focused and more other-focused. And then, that's what this is reminding us. So it's sort of a natural extension and a check. I feel like the Buddha taught this to kind of give us a checkup. Like, are you doing this for the right reason? Like, make sure you're doing this for the right reason. And by reminding us near the end of the meditation, near the end of the instruction, by reminding us that meditate and cultivate goodwill and compassion and equanimity and non-attachment, you should, or observing, understanding impermanence. By looking at those four things, cultivating those four things, I feel like it was verifying and really like for us to check with ourselves, that I've still got heart to my practice. So if that's the self that we have, if that's the sense of self, that's probably an okay self. So if a self, it's kind of a paradox. If a self, your sense of self, is kind, giving, and compassionate, then yourself is probably being well used.
But there is still a self there. But there is still a self, or no?
Well, but whatever self you see it, that doesn't matter so much because it's going to cause a little less harm. At some point, you won't even be thinking so much about yourself. You'll just be thinking about how I can, use what I have to express compassion. Using what I have, yeah, I've got these elements, If I call it myself, so be it, right? At that point, it doesn't matter so much that you call it yourself.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Maybe in some ways it's a similar questions, but it's a different take on the same question. I don't know. Maybe it's too complicated. I don't know if I can put it to words exactly. I really liked Shariputra's reply to Raula that instead of intellectualizing about it, he should sit and meditate and see for himself. Then again, last week, you said something that stuck with me about, we kind of find in the world what we look for in it. So you gave the example of people interested in money or in cars will measure things by those criteria, and the perspective of impermanence. If we kind of put on these glasses when we practice or when we live, then we're more likely to see it, to internalize it, and other forms of practice or other philosophical or spiritual traditions have reached different conclusions. For instance, the Atman in Hinduism, etc. That is very fundamental. And the other, completely other extreme is something like the Dzogchen in Tibetan Buddhism, who start the practice with this emptiness of self as a guiding experience to then meditate on. And I guess what I'm trying to ask, if it's beneficial in your opinion to have non-self as kind of something to start with, as a perspective to keep in mind, or just forgetting about it until we're Raula, if and when discover it for ourselves. if we can do it, because in a way I'm kind of already biased from stuff I've read or heard. I don't know if maybe it's too big a question.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think non-self, first of all, if you start to learn and practice it all in the Dharma, you're going to encounter that idea anyway, right? So it's going to be part of your understanding and of the teaching. And emptiness is also taught in the Theravada as well. The Buddha talks about emptiness and emptiness of self. He doesn't mean it exactly. I mean, Dzogchen and even in Zen, the way they talk about emptiness is slightly different. It's true. It's more, as you said, something you start with. And here it's something that you kind of like, you let go of all the things. And I would say that in Theravada, it's more like an onion where you peel away the skins, and in the center, there's nothing there, right? Whereas in the Dzogchen tradition, you're sort of starting at the center, and then from there, you're seeing all the peels as kind of like untrue or just like form. But the process is simply different. Now, in order to start with emptiness and for it not to be a nice idea, you kind of need a lot of a very deep meditation. It's hard to do that in the lay life without it being just a fanciful idea. So in the lay life, I think it's more practical to look at all the things we use for ourselves and to say onion skin, and to peel it away, right? And to see that. With the type of faith, you see, you can have that idea that the nature of the self is empty and that, the core is open. You can understand that, but it's not about understanding we want. We want like a sort of a full-blown experience to change our minds in the way we look around at things. And that sort of realization is not going to be, a kind of really good idea. So the question you have to ask yourself then is, according to your own personality and your own relationship to the world, as starting at, these are different skillful means, different upaya, connected to different people, So do you need to feel like you have this sort of openness and then try to understand from that place the world around you? Or do you want to work through the world around you and realize that openness? So that's kind of something, when you sit, you can sort of have a little sense of where your mind is at. Not many people can start with emptiness. That's what I'll say. And if you want to, then you need a really good trained teacher in that who's realized emptiness. But I wouldn't. The contemplations the Buddha gives are possible when you don't have a teacher sitting beside you guiding you through it. That's why, like Shariputra said, you try this, and then he left. And Rahula is sitting there for a while until he gets frustrated and he says, what am I doing? Yeah. So yeah, I do think that when, as lay people without like this intense support, probably working through form and getting to the core is more practical. But you have to simply be aware of your own mind. And if you have had experiences of selfless emptiness, and it's something that you can recall in your mind, then maybe a Dzogchen is more is suitable. Or even, in Zen, we do sit, when we sit, we're not looking at the breath as much as when as they do in the Theravada. So the instructions are slightly different in terms of, opening up to the space. So I could say that the Zen is much more focused on the element of space. When we talk about these 5 elements, so in Zen, it's the element of space that is more like the primary element we're looking at. And that's allowing your mind to open up to the space, the inner and outer space. And that's something that I think is there, and it's sort of a midpoint in between like emptiness and just the form is the element of space as your meditation object. Right. Probably not much of an answer for you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Great answer.
I think it's time to walk the dog. That's my feeling. That's why he jumped up on here. Any other question before we go? Okay, I hope we'll be able to sit in person and meet in person in the next couple weeks. I'm hoping, but who knows? No expectations, no disappointments. I hope everyone has a good week, though, and that you stay healthy and happy. All right, and I want to thank you for this. Okay.